Good morning. Today's story is called The Curious Garden. I wonder if you've ever grown a garden. Well, here's a most unusual garden. The Curious Garden by Peter Brown. There once was a city without gardens or trees or greenery of any kind. Most people spent their time indoors. As you can imagine, it was a very dreary place. However, there was one boy who loved being outside. Even on drizzly days when everyone else stayed inside, you could always find Liam happily splashing through his neighborhood. It was on one such morning that Liam made several surprising discoveries. He was wandering around the old railway, as he did from time to time, when he stumbled upon a dark stairwell leading up to the tracks. The railway had stopped working ages ago, and since Liam had always wanted to explore the tracks, there was only one thing for the curious boy to do. Liam ran up the stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the railway. The first thing he saw was a lonely patch of color. Wildflowers and plants were the last things he'd expected to find. But when he took a closer look, it became clear that the plants were dying. They needed a gardener. Well, Liam may not have been a gardener, but he knew that he could help. So he returned to the railway the very next day and got to work. The flowers nearly drowned, and he had a few pruning problems, but the plants patiently waited while Liam found better ways of gardening. As the weeks rolled by, Liam began to feel like a real gardener, and the plants began to feel like real plants. Most gardens stay in one place, but this was no ordinary garden. With miles of open railway ahead of it, the garden was growing restless. It wanted to explore. The tough little weeds and mosses were the first to move. They popped up farther and farther down the tracks and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. Over the next few months, Liam's garden spread. After spending his spring and summer and autumn with the garden, Liam's time on the railway was finally interrupted by winter. Heavy blankets of snow fell on the city that season, and for the first time since he'd become a gardener, Liam could not visit the plants. Rather than waste his winter worrying about the garden, Liam spent it preparing for spring. After 3 cold months, the snow finally began to melt, and Liam rolled his new gardening gear over to the railway. Winter had taken a toll on the garden, but thanks to Liam's planning, his handy new tools, and a little help from the sun, the plants soon awoke from their winter sleep. The garden had always wanted to explore the rest of the city, and that spring it was finally ready to make its move. Once again, the tough little weeds and mosses set out first. They popped up farther and farther from the railway and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. The garden was especially curious about old, forgotten things. A few plants popped up where they didn't belong. Others mysteriously popped up all at once. But the most surprising things that popped up were the gardeners. Many years later, the entire city had blossomed, but of all the new gardens, Liam's favorite was where it all began. On the railway, where it all began on that railway, where it looked like there was no real life, where he saw a few remnants of plants, just a little bit of dead flowers, but he brought it back to life, didn't he? He nurtured it, he cared for it. And then the plants continued to spread all on their own. That's pretty amazing. But I think my favorite part is where not just plants are popping up, but more gardeners are popping up. That reminds me of how love spreads too. Have you ever thought about that? The way it just starts with one person. Just started with Liam, loving the earth and caring for the plants. And those plants continued to grow and spread. And then other people saw what was happening and they wanted to be a part of it too. They wanted to be a part of nurturing and caring for the earth, for loving the earth. And that's a way that we show love for one another, by caring for the earth, and the way we show love for God, by caring for the earth. And it also reminded me of a bit of a poem from the Bible, from a book called Jeremiah, that says, "Happy is the one who trusts in God, for that one is like a tree planted by water." Liam's garden needed water, didn't it? It also needed a lot of love. And there was a lot of happiness that came because of that garden. And we can grow, we grow too, don't we? We grow differently from plants. And we don't really have to worry about the cold winter because we have places to shelter. But we grow and flourish with love, with some water, with some care, with community. So I hope you'll think about that and remember this story and of how one gardener shared his love with other gardeners and how those plants made the world a more beautiful place. Let's have a prayer. God of love, thank you that we are like trees planted by water. We receive your love, we receive your care, and we know that love and care through those who love us, through our families and friends. And help us to be like those trees that brought so much joy, those plants that brought so much joy, made that city a beautiful place. Thank you that we can be like that too, showing your love to the world. Amen.